Thank
you very much, Rav Amon, for your participation and for chairing the evening, and thank you for your assistance. And my dear friend, Dr. Dayan Lutrin, thank you very much for everything. And your participation, your friendship, learning with you over the past 6 years, and a beautiful initiative came out of it. And thank you for everything that you do for our community. So may Hashem bless you and your family with good, long life and good health. Thank you very much. Before, I would like to begin with another couple of thank yous. And the first one is to Rabbi Dayan Dr based in Rosh, based in Johannesburg in South Africa. He was the first one that was open for this initiative, and for teaching me that the fact that we did something over the past 50 years, it doesn't say that we need to carry on the same thing for the next 50 years. He was the first one. He took me to a few poskim in Jerusalem, Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg and Rav Osher Weiss, and they spent time we tried to consult with them. So he was the first one. I would like to thank my colleagues, the Dayanim, the esteemed Dayanim of the Johannesburg Based Din, as well as the Hatzalah that joined us at some point and drove the process, and the doctors that joined us, I believe, will mention the names as well. And of course, the chief rabbi. I think the idea of getting the involvement of Hatzalah was his idea, and for supporting us. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I would like just to start with a disclosure. And the first one is I'm a student of two great rabbis that were part of a very historical decision in '87. One is Rabbi Shapira, who was the chief rabbi at that time, and the second one, Rabbi Shaul Israeli, was one of the Dayanim in the Supreme Court, the Beis Din HaGadol. He was my Rosh Hashiva, two Rosh Hashivas. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, that we just commemorated his 10th Yortzeit, also spent a few years in his Shia. Three great rabbis that were part of the historical decision in '87. I would like to mention their decision, but you need to be aware I'm a student of these rabbis that took that decision, and this is the first one. And the second one, I'm holding a card that my wife and myself, it's called Bilvavi. My wife and myself, we decided in 2012 to sign. And I would like to explain the reason for this. It was after the amendment of the law in 2008. So I'm saying I'm part of it. But tonight I would like not to express my personal opinion. And I would like to be honest and to express the position of the Beis Din. They took, I think, a very historical decision to allow the community to choose and to help and to support and to guide and to supervise the system. So I'm not going to express my personal opinion, but the position of the Beis Din of Johannesburg, which I am a member of the Beis Din. So let's start from the very beginning. As Dr. Lutrin described, we have two kinds of organ donation or organ transplant. One is from a live person, and the second one for after the death. From a live person like kidney or lung, alive people can donate. It's very common, very popular in Israel at the moment. Many people donate kidneys. And there's one settlement that someone told me that you need to be very embarrassed to walk in the streets of that settlement with two kidneys. So I'm saying the first option of donating organs from alive. This is one discussion, and it's not our discussion of today, because if you want, that's based on a very famous tshuva from Radvaz, Rabbi David ibn Zimra for the 16th century. It's a great mitzvah, but it's not compulsory. You can't force someone based, even though the Torah says, Lo ta'amod adam b'recha, if you see someone drowning in the river, you have to assist him, you need to save him, but not at the expense of one of your organs. So it's a great, great mitzvah, what he calls midat chasidut, but you can't say it's compulsory. This is one kind of organ donations. There's another kind of organ donation after the death, like heart. We're going to speak a lot about heart, like part of the liver. First of all, so we have two different questions. The first question is it allowed? Because you know, the three mitzvahs of prohibitions that you're not allowed, for example, to benefit from the deceased. We have an obligation to bury the deceased. And we have a prohibition to disgrace the body after the death. So three different prohibitions that you're not allowed to disgrace the deceased or to benefit from the body of the deceased. We have an obligation to bury him. But all of these prohibitions can't stand against such a precious mitzvah of saving people's life. So we're talking here about the question of life and death, and the pikuach nefesh, we know pikuach nefesh overrides all of the prohibitions of the Torah, besides 3, and these 3 are not one of them. So if you are asking about the obligation to bury the deceased, or about disgracing the prohibition to disgrace the deceased or to honor him, we are talking here about such a precious mitzvah of saving people's life, so that that precious mitzvah can override most of the mitzvahs or most of the prohibitions, including the 3 that I just mentioned. Now we have another discussion. That was just one discussion so that easily we can sort it out. There's another discussion about determining the moment of death, because we know that you can't donate a heart while the person is alive. So we're talking about after the death. So that's why it's so important to determine the moment of death. And here comes the biggest question. The poskim, I would like to explain the history. The poskim over the past 200 years discussed when is the moment, what determines the moment of death, the heart or the brain. Now, if what determines the moment of death is the heart, the collapse of the heart, so full stop, we can't donate the heart, because once the heart is collapsed, you can't use the heart in order to transplanting the heart in someone else's body. But if what determines the moment of death is the brain, so once the brain collapsed, and especially the brain stem, which is very, very important, I'm going to explain that point. Once the brain collapsed, and we know for sure, and you can test it in different ways, and we can know for sure that the brain collapsed completely, including that part of the brain stem, so then you can still use the beating heart in order to transplant the beating heart in someone else's body. So this is the major question. What determines the moment of death, the heart or the brain? Now let me start from the beginning. The beginning of the 18th century, 1778. There was a decree from the Duke of Kellenberg. And at that time, no one spoke about organ transplant, and they spoke about a different question. The question wasn't about organ transplant. The question was about what determines, or when, how, when is the moment of death in order to allow the family to bury the deceased. That was the question. Now, the Duke in 1778, the Duke of Kellenberg in Germany, made a new law that because of a few mistakes, they need, according to that new law, to wait with the burial for 3 days. And after 3 days, the family could bury the deceased. And it was very difficult for the Jews. And all of the poskim in Germany, and especially the Avets at that time, were against it. It's nivulamet, all of the prohibition that I just mentioned. How can you wait 3 days when you know that he passed away? You need to bury him. This is the chesed that you can do for the deceased, to bury him as soon as possible. You have the obligation to bury him as soon as possible. Now, the only one was Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was an observant Jew and a proud Jew. But he wrote a kuntra, some kind of a booklet to say that maybe it's okay. All of the rabbis of Germany were against it. Now that encouraged the poskim to begin the halachic discussion. What exactly determines the moment of death? Again, we're not talking at the moment about organ transplant. Now the next discussion, when the research came that it's possible to donate a heart in order to save someone else's life, so the poskim discussed again. Now, in the beginning, before the 80s, the assumption of the poskim, and I'm talking now about 2 great poskim, like Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in America, like Rav Unterman, he was the chief rabbi at that time. After Rav Herzog and before Rav Goren, he was the chief rabbi, he was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, he was in Ireland before. So both great poskim, Rav Moshe Feinstein in America, Rav Unterman in Israel, they paskin and it's not allowed. And moreover, Rav Moshe Feinstein, in one of these early tshuvas, he called it double murder. Because at that time, the assumption was that if you take the heart, one, you are murdering the sick person, because if the assumption is that what determines the moment of death is the heart and not the brain, so if you try to take the heart, so now you're killing that person. One murder. And the second murder is if you're trying to transplant the recipient that receives that donation, the heart, at that time, before the beginning of the 80s, the surgeries weren't successful. So Moshe Feinstein at that time, he called it double murder. You murder the donor and you are murdering the recipient. Apparently, Moshe Feinstein changed his mind, and it's a big, big debate because one of the tshuvas that we'll see in a minute, we at some point, he speaks about breathing. He doesn't speak about the heart, he speaks about the collapse of the system that controls the breathing. But at that time, before the beginning of the 80s, so he was very against it. Now in 87, the Council of the Chief Rabbinate, with the great rabbi that I mentioned, Rav Avram Shapira as the Chief Rabbi, Rav Mordechai Liavda as the Sephardi Chief Rabbi, Rav Shaul Israeli is one of the great poskim, Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, and others, and two rabbis and doctors, Professor Steinberg that was here recently that helped us a lot, and Dr. Moti Halperin, all of them together, they took a principal decision that they, I would like to explain why, but they decided that halachically what determines the moment of death is the brain and not the heart. Now, what I would like to do now shortly, just to explain the background and to explain exactly what happened in Israel in 87, the amendment of the law in 2008, and then to explain what can we do here based on the decision of the Beis Din here in South Africa. So first of all, let's use now, and I would like to use the source sheet that I used in my course that I gave a few years ago. It was very theoretical at that time, and people asked me, but it's not allowed in South Africa. So before the initiative, so I would like to use a few sources. You can see in front of you that first of all, everything is based. Again, I must say, I try to shorten, to simplify the share, even though it's very complicated and you need to understand. I would like to present two opinions in the poskim without deciding, just to explain to you the background of the disagreement, what determines the moment of death. And again, just to simplify, to use the main source. So you can see in front of you that in source number 1, the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah speaks about someone, the Mishnah is Masechet Yoma, the Mishnah speaks about someone that fell under a pile of stones. Now he fell under a pile of stones that in principle on Shabbos, you can't just take the stones to bring it to another place. It's something not allowed on Shabbos. But we're talking here about Pikuach Nefesh. So without the person under the pile of the stone, you're not allowed to do this because it's breaking Shabbos. But because of Pikuach Nefesh, the Mishnah says clearly, Pikuach Nefesh overrides everything. Besides that we prohibition that I mentioned before, but in principle, Pikuach Nefesh overrides Shabbos. So therefore, if you have even a doubt if he's alive, so then you can save him. You can remove the stones in order to save his life. Now, if he's dead, so then we respect the body, but it's not something that you can override Shabbos for this. So therefore, it's important to understand he's alive or dead. Because if he's still alive, so then you can break Shabbos in order to save his life. So that's what the Mishnah says. If a pile of stone fell on someone, if you can save his life, you can break Shabbos. But if he's dead, you can't. And if you have a doubt, of course you can, because of Pikuach Nefesh, Doche Shabbat, even if it's a doubtful situation. But if you know that he is dead, so then you can't break Shabbos for this. After Shabbos, you can honor the deceased. Now, it's very important because then the next source you can see, and let me explain it briefly, but I think it's very, very important. So in the next source, you can see that the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah, the Gemara tries to understand how far does one check? And the Gemara speaks about two parameters. And the Gemara says we have two ways, the two parameters, one of them you should check. So the Gemara says, how far does one check? Until his nose, or others say until his heart. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's use a few pictures that be prepared. Rav Ramon, if you can show the next one, the pictures. Oh, okay. So you can see at the top of the page, you can see that person is under the pile of stones. So you can see we have two parameters. We need to decide what determines the moment of death. Like the Gemara asks, how far does one check? Because once you decided that he's dead, so unfortunately you can't help him on Shabbos. But if he's still alive, you need to help him on Shabbos to break Shabbos. So we have two ways. One is the breathing, the nose. And the Gemara speaks about the nose because through the nose, you can see if he still breathes. and the Gemara speaks about the heart. So the question is, do you dig up to the nose to make sure that it breathes or doesn't breathe, or should dig up to the heart? That's what the Gemara says, and the Gemara brings it as a disagreement, two opinions. Now then the Gemara tries to explain, it's not really clear from where, because let's assume that we have a pile of stones. And then first of all, you can start digging. For example, the Gemara says, what happens if you start digging from the feet upwards? And what happens if you start digging from the head downwards? So the Gemara says like this: yes, we have two options. One, up to the nose, which represents the breathing, and second, up to the heart, which represents the heart. So the Gemara says, depends. Yes, we have a disagreement. But the disagreement is if you start from the feet. If you start from the feet, like in the second picture, so first of all, you can see the heart and then the breathing. So says the Gemara, the disagreement, if you start from that, so then first of all, you can check the heart, and then maybe it's not enough, you need to carry on. And then should carry on to the nose to see if the breathing. But the Gemara says, according to everybody, if you start from the top, from the head, downward, you don't need to carry on. Once, says the Gemara clearly, once you check the nose, once you check the breathing, you don't need to carry on to check the heart. If you check the heart, you need to carry on to check, and there we have the disagreement. But according to everybody, if you check the breathing, the nose that represents the breathing, you don't need to carry on. And why? So the Gemara says, the Gemara brings a passage that everything is based on breathing. Kol asher nishmat ruachim ba'apiv. If he still breathes, so halachically, according to the Gemara, he is alive. Look, ladies and gentlemen, this is the conclusion of the Gemara. The Gemara is very clear. Once you check that he still breathes, he's still alive. But if he unfortunately doesn't breathe anymore, you don't need to check the heart. The assumption is that what comes up from the Gemara, that what determines the moment of death is not the collapse of the heart, is the collapse of the breathing system. And today we know that the way to determine that the person unfortunately doesn't breathe anymore, not to use a feather and to put next to his nose, but to check the collapse of the brain stem. Because we know that the brain stem controls the system of breathing. So once you check today, I'm saying at that time, you need to check the nose to see there's no breathing. And that's what determines the moment of death. But today you just can check the brain stem, and if the brain stem collapses irreversibly, so then you don't need to check the heart, because halachically he is a dead person, and then you can use his heart for transplanting and for save someone else's life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the conclusion of the Gemara. And the Rambam is very clear. The Rambam in his commentary, in the next source, you can see, the Rambam says clearly, when you get to the nose, you know that if he doesn't breathe anymore, unfortunately he's dead. That's what the Rambam says. That's the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Now, as I mentioned, in the 18th century, there was a long debate regarding to the decree of the Duke of Kellenberg. Now, one of the poskim, 60 years after, was the Khatam Sofer. In the 19th century, at that time, that decree was accepted in most of the countries of Europe. Now, when the Khatam Sofer, before that, let's see if we can skip to the next page. We can see, first of all, Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi was the father of the Yavetz, who was very, very against that decree and the kundros of Moshe Mendelssohn. But the Chacham Tzvi that lived in the 17th century, when he tries to understand the Gemara, he says, you know what? The breathing comes from the heart. The breathing comes from the heart. So I just tried to explain that the breathing, what controls the breathing system is the brain. But that's the way he understood. And part of the poskim quoted, the Chacham Tzvi said, look, Chacham Tzvi says that everything comes from the heart. So yes, the Gemara says that you need to make sure that he doesn't breathe anymore to determine is death. But he speaks about the breathing that comes from the heart. So I spoke to Professor Steinberg, and he told me that that's the way they understood at that time, that the breathing comes from the heart. Today we know that the heart can carry on beating, and the brain stem collapsed completely. So apparently there's no way that he can really breathe independently. Now let's carry on the Khatam Sofer. You can see Khatam Sofer in the next source, and the Khatam Sofer gives us 3 criteria. And now he speaks about mutal ke'even domem. He's lying as still as a stone. This is the first criterion. It doesn't move. Now today we have a different way to determine the moment of death, but that's the way that first of all he doesn't move. The second thing, ve'en bo tfika, apparently the translation here says no heartbeat. And the third, he speaks about breathing. Now we can understand the Khatam Sofer differently, but I would like to show you the decision of the chief rabbinate in 87, they learned from the Khatam Sofer that basically what determines the moment of death, even according to Khatam Sofer, is not the heartbeat and not the fact that he can't move. Sometimes you have an explanation why he can't move. Is the breathing. The main part, the main criterion is the breathing, and they try to understand even the Khatam Sofer in that way. Now we can see in the next source of Moshe Feinstein in that Shuvah, without reading, just to tell you that at that time, in the first Shuvah, he said that it's double murder, but then in the next Shuvah, you can see that he says, in the Shuvah, you can see Kuf Lamed Bet, he says, apparently he changed his mind because towards the end of the Shuvah, you can see clearly that he speaks about breathing. And he gives the halachic guidance how exactly to decide that person is dead in order to start the procedure of the burial. Is everything is about the breathing. So apparently he changed his mind, and it came, one of the rabbis that took part of the discussions of the council, the chief rabbinate, was of Shabtai Rapport, that is the son-in-law of Tendler, the son-in-law of Moshe Feinstein, and he says that practically that towards the end, Moshe Feinstein gave the permission to people to be part of it. Now, I would like to end off with this. And there's in the next source, you can see the decision of the Council of the Chief Rabbinate. And let's try to read everything because it's going to be a summary for everything that we learned up to now. So Avramon, if you can help us, just let's read it. And I would like to explain something afterwards about the amendment of the law. Yes, the Council of the Chief Rabbinate.
So this is the decision of the Chief Rabbinate in Tchumen. The Council of Chief Rabbinates meeting on the first day of Rosh Chodesh Mar Cheshvan unanimously approved the recommendations of the Transplant Committee as follows. When heart transplants were first developed 17 years previously, Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal, as well as the Israeli Chief Rav, which was Rav Issi Yehuda Unterman, forbade undergoing a heart transplant as they considered it to be double murder of both donor and recipient. Over the last 10 years, there have been fundamental changes in the medical data. The success of the operations have improved, 80% 1-year survival rate, which is an halachically significant extension of life, and a 70% 5-year survival rate. It's possible today to determine reliably and certainly that the donor cessation of breathing is final and irreversible. Testimony was presented that even Rav Moshe Feinstein permitted heart transplants in the US towards the end of his life. We know of many other great rabbis who advised people with cardiac diseases to undergo the transplants. And based on the principles of the Gemara and the reading of the Khatam Sofer, halachic death is defined as cessation of breathing. Therefore, one must ensure that breathing is stopped absolutely and irreversibly. This can be determined by proof of total brain death, including the brainstem, which controls independent breathing.
Okay, I think it's thank you very much. I think it's a very nice summary, and everything, again, we have the Gemara, the conclusion of the Gemara in Masechet Umata. Apparently, the Gemara speaks about breathing. And the assumption, we have the Khatam Sofer. They understood the Khatam Sofer that he's also speaking, put the emphasis of breathing. And they took one step further, that you don't need to take the feather to make sure that the person doesn't breathe anymore. And just today you can decide that he doesn't breathe anymore based on the collapse of the brain stem, and then you know that he's completely dead. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it was a very historical decision at that time in 87. I remember that. But nothing really happened for a very simple reason. Because the decision was that in principle what determined the moment of death is the breathing, the brain stem. But then, practically, they guided the hospitals, and especially at that time, they spoke to Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. They have a special relationship, a connection with the hospital, and they trusted them. And practically, they said, in principle, what determines the moment of death is the brain death and not the heart. But one, you need to check certain things before, to make sure that you checked properly, to make sure that it won't be a double murder, that someone is in a hasty process. He wants to save a young man, so you won't look after the old person. So you need to make sure that a certain tests should be done. And second, said the council, the chief rabbinate, that you need to make sure that one of the moral committee that takes the decision and determine the model should be a rabbi. Now, what happened? The hospital refused to join a rabbi. Even, rabbis and doctors like Professor Steinberg and Dr. Moti Halpern, they were very expert in both fields. They just refused because of kavod or because of I don't know what. They just refused, and everything collapsed. Now, I'm saying it was an historical decision, and nothing happened. Now, recently, as I mentioned, of course, it took me to Rabbi Zalman Goldberg to get his advice. And he told me, now, Rabbi Zalman Goldberg was part of the decision that I mentioned in 87. But he told me, like, that was the halachic decision that we took at that time, but everything collapsed because the hospitals didn't want to cooperate. Now, what happens? In 2008, Otniel Schneiner, he was a Knesset member from a party called the Kadima, Arik Sharon, Olmert, whatever. He lived in Alon Shvut, a from Knesset member. He decided to amend the law. And based on the law in 2008, and the law forces the hospital to accept 3 rabbis as part of the moral committee. So according to the new law, you need to have in that committee 3 doctors that the Ministry of Health decide whom. 3 rabbis, that one of them should be a rabbi and a doctor, that the chief rabbi should decide. And another expert in philosophy, another expert in morality, and one non-Jew. That was the decision. So from that, so practically what happened? The decision was taken by the chief rabbinate in principle in 87. But then practically no one implemented it. So therefore he changed the law, and from that point of time, legally they have to accept the rabbis, and the rabbis set the process. How many tests? About 5 different tests, and maybe Dr. Dlutin will explain different tests, how to attempt to make sure that the process for determining that the collapse of the brainstem was serious and professional according to all of these, and who will be the doctor and so on. Everything was based on the amendment of the law. Now the question was about South Africa, because the difference between Israel, so first we need to understand, and I don't have enough time to explain the other opinion, but you need to understand, many poskim didn't accept it. And the Haredi world, for example, at that time, Rav Eliashiv was against it, the Shevet Alevi, Rav Osner was against it, and Tzitz Eliezer Rav Vandenberg was against it. So we have the decision of Chief Rabbi Rabbi Avram Shapira and Rav Shaul Israeli and Rav Eliyahu and others, and you have the great poskim like Rav Eliashiv and Rav Osner were against it. So it's a disagreement. So the question about the diaspora, first of all, it's a disagreement. Okay, 1. Second, we don't have that procedure. We don't have the law like we have in Israel. The 3 rabbis are part of the process, and they can supervise again and decide which doctor will be involved and so on. We don't have that. And the last point is about someone told me, maybe we can save a Jew's life. Maybe we don't have the permission to put ourselves in a in a doubtful situation in which you have a disagreement between great rabbis for non-Jews. Now, in the Beis Din, we needed to take a decision about it. And I remember that I wrote to Dr. Moti Halpern, that was part of the decision. He told me, according to the decision that we took, there's no difference between Jews and non-Jews. And then I wrote to Professor Steinberg, that was part of the decision in 87, was very involved in the amendment of the law in 2008. And he told me, based on Rav Neuwirth, the author of Shmirat Shabbat Kilchatai, Rav Halberstam from the Eider Charedis, he told me, there's no difference. There's an issue with hatred that I don't have enough time to explain. And you know what I heard from different people? Jews are the recipients and not the donors. Jews take and don't give. From that point of view, for that kind of tension and hatred, we don't distinguish. And again, I don't have enough time to explain why. That was happened. Now, in the Beis Din, we took a decision. We don't want to decide, you have the great boys scheme that support it and the great boys scheme that don't support it. Now, we need to understand, Agudat Israel at that time, they were against the law. And because of Rav Eliashiv, and they even want to knock down the government at that time. What happened at that time that Rav Amar, he was the Sephardi chief rabbi, and he took a decision to support that law. And Rav Yosef joined Rav Amar. So Shas at that time supported the law. Now I'm saying in the diaspora, we decided that we as a Beis Din, we don't want to decide between the 2 streams, the disagreement between Gdolim. So we decided that we can give the community to decide. We can give people to decide. You need to decide by yourself. You need to consult with your rabbi. Your rabbi will consult with his rabbi. We won't decide for you because halachically, there are two accepted opinions. And there's one opinion based on the chief rabbi decision and great poskim that support this. Now, if you want to follow that stream, we can support you. We can guide you. We can supervise the system to make sure, and we check the Israeli test, and Dr. Nitro will explain, we check the South African test, and we decide to add more on what is accepted here. We'll guide you, we'll support you, we'll make sure that the process, if you decide to follow that opinion, we will supervise the process to make sure that according to all of the tests that the chief rabbinate decided, we're going to support you and to make sure that everything is done according to halacha. So ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly, I'm saying, I gave you the halachic background. I think now what we need to do, just to understand practically the way it could be done. But then I would like to clarify, the position of the Beis Din is not to pass in between the two opinions, is to let you decide, and please consult with your rabbis. But if you want to choose that path, we're going to support you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Glicksberg. Just to, for those who've joined us partway through, just to summarize what Rabbi Glicksberg said in a nutshell, he explored the two different halachic opinions regarding when to determine the point of death, either using brainstem death or cardiac arrest. And what Rabbi Glicksberg showed is that in the state of Israel, that already in 1987, the chief rabbinate took a decision to allow transplants based on the opinion that it is brainstem death. The question then is, how does one create a system to ensure that all the tests that are required are implemented to check brainstem death, which was carried out in Israel? And what we're at the incredible point of, at this point in time in our history in South Africa, is that the Beis Din has made this decision that anyone who wishes to go with the opinion that allows brainstem death as the determinant will have the guidance of the Beis Din in order to be able to do this. And it's a hugely momentous occasion.